For
Thank you.
sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so Linda, I think Cindy wants you to go next. I have a whiteboard prepared for you. Do you
Thank
want
you.
me, do you want me to, well, first of all, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Linda Gribble. I'm a distant cousin of sister and as well as Cindy and Charles. I think I'm like third cousins and sister. I would believe we're maybe I don't know, maybe second cousin twice removed. I'd have to kind of do the chart on that. But anyway, we're distant cousins. We're related on the Horning and Rothermel side. So I'm Linda Gribble. So that's me. And I was going to talk about my dad today.
All right, let me pull up you can talk. We just
Okay.
want to get your introduction, but I want to, let's see, existing whiteboards. We want to pull up, Edward J. Horning,
That's correct.
open board. Okay, I think that's
Yep, that's my dad.
okay. So
So
if you want to add anything to this whiteboard, feel free.
okay, so yeah, so I had also sent you, I don't know if you want to include it or not. I had sent you two pages. The first page was just a list of veterans that I'm descended from. We've had a lot of military service in our family, but with my dad, the second page that I sent to Chuck and then also Cindy and sister, I emailed you. I had kind of like key points with my dad, so I don't know if you're able to
I
upload
don't
the
know that I,
Okay, so I'll just kind of speak to this a little bit. So my dad, his mom kept the diary when she was younger. We don't know where the diary is. I'm not sure where it ended up, but we I know that I mean his birthday was on December 21st, 1926, the day he was born. We know from my grandma's diary he was born at 10 in the morning. My grandma always kept pretty good notes, so I always thought that that was really interesting. My dad grew up in Randolph, Ohio. There were six kids. He was the second son and fourth child of Joe and Bernetta. So where my dad's name is Edward Joseph, his dad was Joseph Edward. It was just reversed. And basically, the other military service, this is kind of interesting before I go into his military service, is that I had met with a woman named Mary Jane Allward years ago, and she did a lot of Horning ancestry. She was also related through the Horning side. She had noticed that the Hornings were pacifists. They did not go to war. And so a lot of my military service was through my grandma's mom, well, through my dad's mom's side. But the Horning side, to the best of my knowledge, he was like the first in his direct line that had ever served in, was ever in the military. So I always thought that that was kind of interesting. But he was educated. He went to St. Joe's in Randolph. And then after St. Joe's, he went to Randolph High School, which the school still exists, but I think it's I should know the name of that now, but it's not called Randolph High School anymore. I think it's like Atwater. But anyway, so he graduated in 1945, at 1941 from grade school, 1945 from high school. The interesting thing was I'm kind of like big in collecting old school yearbooks. And in his high school yearbook, I actually have like two copies of his senior year, not his actual copy, but I was able to track copies down. And when they had to write like little things to remember them by, he had actually put that he wanted to serve in the army. And I always thought that was kind of a little bit prophetic because he actually did. My dad had had some health problems growing up, and one of the big things was he had some vision problems. And I think it was with his right eye, he only had peripheral vision. So he wasn't really, he was permitted to be in the service, but was more or less, I guess, like limited. So as far as like active duty, he wasn't able to do that. But when he had gone in, he always told me he was in the Korean. I don't think he actually mentioned he would say Korean War. I think he mentioned Korean conflict. And then years later, it was kind of interesting because when he passed away, he was buried out at Rittman Cemetery, the military cemetery in Rittman, Ohio. And there was World War II on his gravestone, and I was actually pretty upset about that. And when I called out there to ask about, because I said I was always very insistent. My dad always said Korean, the Korean conflict, but they said because of his dates of military service, the Korean conflict didn't actually start. I believe it was like 1950 to 1953. So it was like he went in at the end of like one conflict, but before the start of the other one. So even though he had always referred to it as Korean conflict, I guess technically it was considered World War II is kind of like this area between the two. So anyway, so that's kind of like his background with that. But when he went in, I thought it was real interesting because sister had her brother as Tech 5. My dad was also a Tech 5. And so I thought that was real interesting. My dad always worked really well with his hands and with appliances and motors and machines and that kind of thing. Um, but when he went in, there was actually a small and on the little kind of the key points that I sent to everybody. I had actually I have a small, and actually it's the original article that was published, I think it was in the Ravenna Courier at the time, and it listed people going in from different cities in Portage County, and my dad was listed in there as one of three men at that time that were going in to serve their country. So I should have attached it to this. I didn't do that. Maybe I can send that to you later and attach it.
I'm looking at your Word document right now. It's really well written.
Oh, thank you. Well, my dad was always, I appreciate that, Chuck. My dad was always a pretty quiet guy. And, I remember Andy, and I got to give Andy some credit to this. But like years before my dad passed away, Andy kept saying to me, "You need to get more information from your dad," and with military service and just his life in general. And so I would find certain times of the week that I was, just with my schedule and my dad and all that, that I was able to talk to him one on one. And I'm really glad I did that, because towards the end of his life, he got pretty sick. But fortunately, I was able to get a few things, um, kind of glean some information from him before he passed away, which I'm glad that I did that. But anyway, when he was in the Army, he served, it was the 24th Corps, 52nd Battalion, the 201st Signal Corps. His military training in the Army began April 9th, 1946. The basic training was in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And he said at that point he traveled by passenger train to California. And when he traveled out there, he resided, I'm kind of reading from a script here, resided temporarily at Camp Stoneman in Oakland. And Oakland, if you're a little familiar with California, it's just across the bay from San Francisco. And from there, so even though again it was like before the Korean conflict, but what's interesting is before the Korean conflict, but after the end of World War II, but yet he did go to Korea. So he had told me, because I was always like, well, where did you stop and where did you go? And he was on the General Black, was the name of the ship that he sailed over on. And I remember I was kind of upset because at one point he actually had a picture of the boat and everybody that was on the boat. I don't know whatever happened to that for some reason or other. I don't know if it got misplaced or not. That was kind of beyond my control. So I've kind of looked online. I can probably find a picture somewhere. Unfortunately, other than his military picture, I don't really have any other pictures of him. I have a picture of like the discharge papers and all that, but a picture of him in uniform, the only one I have is the one that's posted. So unfortunately, unless I can find that somewhere else. But the ship itself made brief stops in Hawaii and Yokohama. But I remember there was something, and I don't know where I put this, but there was some problem with the boiler. And I guess the boiler actually blew up on the ship. And at some point, I think they had to temporarily make a trip back to the US before they shipped back out again. And that was kind of like in some notes that I had taken from him. The final destination was in Korea. When they arrived in Korea, they docked at Incheon. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Now it's spelled like Incheon, but I guess at that time it was spelled different. It was like the ending was just Chon. And I had kind of had that noted in my notes. So I should probably look into that in a little more detail. But my dad had said that there was a city, to the best of his memory, it was called Ascom, Ascom. And again, I need to do a little research to see if I can find that, unless maybe a name has changed over time or whatever. But he had said that's where he was actually at. Um, he always told me that he did cleanup, was kind of how he termed it. So he did like, I think it sounded like it was just like maintenance and maybe like some office work. He was only in for he was in for about 9 months, and I'm going to kind of get to that in a minute. But prior to the end of his service, um, again, my information is what I had gleaned from him and what he shared with me, in addition to some of his discharge papers. And the discharge papers, it said he'd been given handling for an MKM rifle M1. I'm sure, I mean, he was not an active, like as far as out in the field or anything like that, but he was given training on that. And he also received a victory medal as well as an Army of Occupation medal in Japan. And I don't know about all of you. I wish I had those medals of my dad. I never seen them. I don't know where they are. It's kind of upsetting because I do wish that I did have them. But I have found there are organizations online,
I'll
and they,
send you information later on how you can get a record of the medals. Okay.
yeah, that
No,
would be great.
I don't
But
know if they can actually send you, but they can send you paperwork. I did that for Bill Siegfried.
I would be very interested in that because, yeah, thank you. Because I have found some things online, and my understanding is that, I mean, obviously I'll never have the originals, but you can get replacements. And I know I just gotten so busy with school and other things, just life in general last couple of years, but I'm hoping as I get closer to retirement, I really want to delve into this more. And I really do want to get a replacement for those. So any information you could send me would be helpful. That's definitely something that I want to do, just, in loving memory for my dad. His time was really brief. He was only in for 10 months, and my understanding was that he did really well when he was over there. The reason that it was so short was and I know we've talked about this a little before, my grandfather died really young. And it was kind of a surgery that had kind of gone awry. My grandmother was had 6 children to raise largely on her own, and my oldest aunt was like, I think she was barely 14 or was going to turn 14, and my youngest aunt, my dad's kind of in the middle. My youngest aunt, she was just literally born the month before.
Wow.
And so when my dad had gone overseas, he was kind of everybody pitched in to help my grandma the best they could, but he married later in life, and so he was like largely responsible for helping with my grandma. And again, everybody else did, they did what they could, but my dad was really, I think, the one that was kind of like helped and supported her the most. And my understanding has always been that his time was short because it was considered a hardship case with my grandma. This was before aid to dependent children and welfare and all that. And I've often kind of wondered, how did my grandma, I think their house was paid for, but it's like, how was she able to raise 6 children on her own? And at that time, most women stayed home, they raised their kids. Somehow or other she managed. I'm not really sure. I know that she did get help from some of the relatives she would have had to have, but my dad's time was short because basically his mom needed probably the support and the income. I'm sure he was probably sending home a lot of the income he got in the service at home, but he had worked at Ohio Edison prior to the time of shipping out. My understanding is I think they gave you credit for the time that you were gone. He came back and resumed this time with Ohio Edison, and I think by the time he retired, he had like 45 years of service. But I think his time coming back, my guess is basically the pay from Ohio Edison was probably higher. I don't know, but he was able to be of more help and support to his mom, who was getting older at that time. When he left, obviously he did have an honorable discharge, and there was a certificate attending to such was given. There was a separation center in Fort Sheridan, Illinois, that was issued to him on January of 1947. So again, at that time, his time had been less than a year, but obviously doing the best he can given the circumstances. And he was recommended for further military training. So that's pretty much what I have with my dad. So I know Andy's dad was he was a very analytical person. He always wrote everything down. We actually have quite a bit on Andy's dad just from notes that he left us. But with my dad, this was I was able to get as much information from him as I could. So this was I'm very fortunate to have that. So, but anyway, so that's just my dad's journey through the military and serving in the U.S. Army. So.